Hello, and thank you for joining me for a little journey through the Peloponnese, the southern half of Greece, that great landmass shaped like a human hand with fingers pointing south, which are in fact great rocky capes reaching out into the Mediterranean Sea, or as the medieval people pictured it, a mulberry leaf, a morea, which was their name for that Peloponnese or island of Pelops. That landmass is connected to mainland Greece, including Attica and the city of Athens, by a very narrow isthmus, not much more than a couple of miles across. And in ancient times, in fact, there were ideas on the part of Spartans and Corinthians and other Greeks who lived in the Peloponnese of fortifying that isthmus with a great wall, sort of Great Wall of the Peloponnese, to keep out Persians and other invaders who might march down from the north. Most people visit the Peloponnese starting from Athens, going down the modern four-lane toll road. But we want to make a stop as we go down. We're going to need to get off the main highway and check out one of the most amazing engineering feats to be seen in all of the Greek, Aegean, and Turkish world. I am referring to the wondrous Corinth Canal, which slices right through the isthmus and connects the Corinthian Gulf on the west, which opens out into the Ionian Sea and the western Mediterranean, with the Saronic Gulf in the east, which opens into the Aegean Sea and then onward to Turkey and the rest of Asia. The Corinth Canal was actually envisioned approximately 2,000 years ago by the Emperor Nero, who brought slaves from the Judean revolt in the first century of our era, large gangs of slaves, captives, prisoners, with the intention that they should dig through this isthmus, this little neck of land, and allow his warships to pass through unimpeded from the western seas to the eastern seas. And in fact, if you go to the Corinth Canal today, and I am insisting that you make a stop, you will see at its western end a sort of miniature Mount Rushmore monument, a little panel carved into the bedrock beside the western entrance to the canal, the only part that the Romans' slaves got very far into before they gave up the attempt. You will see a little panel that shows the Emperor Nero displayed as the hero god Hercules or Heracles to show the might and the power behind the emperor as he planned to drive this great canal through this solid neck of land. As you come down the modern road, look sharp, you will see signs describing the stop for the Corinth Canal. It's a good stopping place anyway. You want your frappe or your iced coffee, you want a little break from the hard driving that has gotten you out of the city of Athens, and believe me, it is a little hard, certainly on the driver. And you want to be able to see this fantastic canal from above, because although the isthmus is not very far across, it rises pretty high, and there's a great cleft in the rock leading down to the bluish-green waters of that canal. When you make the stop at the little touristic station there at the canal's edge, leave your car, have your drink, and then walk out on the bridge that carries the old road across the canal, look down and marvel at the force of the vision, the skill of the engineers, the determination of the diggers in getting through this long passage of rock back in the 1880s and 1890s when the canal was built. In my opinion, it's not enough to see the Corinth Canal from above. There's a little old road that will take you down to the eastern entrance of the canal, where there's a bridge at the canal's level that spans the waterway and that sinks out of sight, the roadway disappearing below the water every time a boat needs to come through. This was an alternative to a suspension bridge that would rise in order to let the boats go through. It's very interesting and sort of a mystical experience to see the roadway disappear. It's always interesting to see it reemerge and see if any hapless fish were caught on the roadway and are now flopping around trying to escape. You can see all this as well as viewing the beautiful parade of boats, all of them fairly small, passing through this canal from one of the two lovely cafes that are on either side of the Corinth Canal. You're also very close to the first of the great religious sanctuaries, which is on the far side, the southern side, the Peloponnesian side of the canal, the sanctuary to Poseidon. This is Poseidon's territory. It's not only a place where two seas meet, it's a place that was somewhat prone to earthquakes. Poseidon has a nickname in the Homeric epics, Poseidon the Earthshaker. When he stirred the seas with his trident, the Greeks were aware earthquakes happened on land, and they were aware of the connection between tsunamis at sea and earthquakes on land. So Poseidon's chief celebratory place, his sanctuary above all others in the Greek world, was at the Isthmus of Corinth, a place called Isthmia. And under the pine trees, which were sacred to Poseidon because they were the timber from which ships were built, and he's the god of ships, under those pine trees, the Greeks would meet in council for special pan-Hellenic efforts, such as the war to keep out the Persians when Xerxes brought his armies across from Asia in 480 BC. The Greeks assembled for a pan-Hellenic conference in this very historic Isthmus of Corinth sanctuary. And you will also see the stadium and the other athletic fields for the games in honor of Poseidon, which were one of the 4 crown games of the Hellenic sporting tradition, games where the athletes competed not for a cash prize, but for a laurel crown at Delphi, laurel sacred to Apollo, for a crown of wild olive at Olympia, game sacred to Zeus, and for a crown of wild celery at Nemea in the Peloponnese, other games sacred to Zeus, and here at the Isthmus, for a crown woven of twigs of pine trees from the sanctuary of Poseidon in these great games at the Isthmus. I urge you to go to this sanctuary, though there is very little to see, but there's one important thing there that was found nowhere else at any of the other sanctuaries. It's been a puzzle for a long time. How did they start the running races in the things called the stadion, the stadia? We give it the Latin term stadium in our track and field events. How'd they get those runners started? In many cases, a sort of a threshold made of stone with 2 grooves along it had been found in all the stadiums as the starting post. And it was clear that the toes of one foot of each runner would go in the forward groove and the other foot behind, and that they would somehow crouch to start the sprint. But there were little square holes beside each runner's place that had obviously held some sort of post, and it was only the excavations at the sanctuary of Poseidon, which we are visiting right now, at the Isthmus, that made the whole system clear. A judge, a referee, a starter, was down in a pit. He was holding cords in his hand that were looped through those standing stakes behind which the runners were crouching. When, at the starting signal, that starter let go of the ropes, the poles fell with them. They didn't need to worry about false starts. If you false started, you had no chance. So it was a perfect system in an age when it would have been very troublesome to call back false starts or deal with complaints that, no, I didn't start early, to have this very simple method, something that we might consider in our own time. Having left the sanctuary of Poseidon behind, we are ready now to take the road to the city that gave its name to the Isthmus of Corinth, Corinth itself. Corinth had an extraordinary reputation among the Greeks. It was a city of Aphrodite, goddess of love. It was believed to be a city of unimaginable luxury, of sexual license. Even the pastries of Corinth were considered to be the best and most luxurious in the Greek world. The Corinthians had made themselves a wealthy people through being near this isthmus. They charged tolls for all the other Greeks who wanted to come to the isthmus from east or west and then haul their ships overland to get to the other body of water. Following, in the days before the canal, a thing called the diolkos, the hauling across place, which was a trackway carved into the stone with things that looked a little like railway tracks in it. And there were great carts onto which an entire ship could be loaded for that hauling across. People thus avoided the dangerous capes at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, capes like Tenairon and Mallia. Mallia being so dangerous, there was a saying, abandon hope when you approach Cape Malea. That was the spot where Odysseus got blown off course in Homer's Odyssey when he was trying to get home. Took him another 9 years to make it. The Corinthians originally had a fabulously beautiful city. In order to get some idea of the glory of Corinth, I recommend starting by penetrating the modern city of Corinth and going straight through to the gigantic Acropolis on the far side, the southern side. This Acropolis, called the Acro-Corinth, High Corinth, puts all other Acropolis, including the one in Athens, to shame. And I strongly recommend, unless you want a really stiff athletic workout, that you go by car or by bus as high up its slope as you can to a little parking area near one of the gates into the summit area of the Acro-Corinth. We can see a spring, now in an underwater spring house, called Pyrene, famous in Greek lore as the place where the winged horse Pegasus struck the rock with his hoof and allowed these magical waters to come out. We can also see that temple of Aphrodite, where women would worship the goddess partly through sexual services to men, getting Corinth a reputation that had lasted down to the time of Paul the Apostle and the early Christians as a center for sin and iniquity. Enjoy that view from the Acro-Corinth and look at the amazing fortifications, classical Greek through the Byzantine, Franks from the era of the Crusades, the Venetians. These successive conquerors all left their mark on this seemingly impregnable hill. And all those views to take in every direction, north to the Gulf of Corinth, southward into the Peloponnese itself. But you're going to want to get down very soon into Corinth itself. It appears to be, from the Acro-Corinth, a large spread of ruins lying there at the foot of the mountain. But in fact, you're in for a disappointment if you think it's going to yield you anything like the wonders of Athens, where so much of the classical Greek architecture has been preserved. Corinth paid a terrible price during the period when Rome was steadily conquering the Eastern Mediterranean. There was a time when it appeared that the Greek states might be able to hold out and maintain their independence against the expansion of Rome. Corinth defied Rome in the 2nd century BC and paid the price when, in the year 146 BC, the conquering Romans leveled the city to the ground. Almost everything except a few sacred structures was destroyed without trace. So we can see less of ancient Corinth than almost any other comparably important site from the ancient Greek world. Nonetheless, to visit the Agora, the civic center of ancient Corinth, is still a very moving experience. For one thing, as you will see when you come to this Agora, the sort of gateway into ancient Corinth for the modern visitor, there are the remains of an extraordinary temple, not to Aphrodite, but to her half-brother, Apollo. Look closely at those Doric columns. They are extraordinary in that they are monolithic. You remember the Parthenon columns were made of separate drums, stacked one on top of the other. These are single shafts of marble, still holding high a number of their Doric capitals and pieces of the architrave that span the tops of those columns. Beyond that, as you will see, parts of the ancient theater of Dionysus were spared by the Romans. But here we begin to see a process of Romanization. The Romans weren't happy with just a place for plays, tragedies, comedies. They wanted action. So they arranged to flood the ancient theater of Dionysus, the playing area, so they could have violent mock sea battles, just as they had ultimately in the Colosseum back home, right there in what had been the Theater of Dionysus in Corinth. When you get to the Site Museum for Corinth, you will see lots of beautiful Roman mosaics. They're beautiful, but to me they signal something very sad in the history of Greek civilization. Back in the glory days of the Golden Age, for Corinth, a great mother city of colonies, a city with a very active citizenship, who joined in the government of their city-state and who made many ventures abroad, both military and colonizing. That was a time where, as in Athens, there were no rich houses, No private individual invested in his home. Their investment was in their city. The monuments that we can still see in Athens, the monuments that the Romans destroyed in Corinth, were gifts to the city from its own citizens, who could think of no better use for their wealth than to beautify the place where they lived and delight their fellow citizens. All that changed with the Roman ways. They went for what the Romans typically went for after the empire came in. After all, there isn't much political participation in an empire on the part of anybody except the ruler himself and his governors. So people retreated into their own homes. Wealthy people beautified those. You'll see some of those fantastic Roman mosaics from homes of the wealthy in Corinth during the time of the Roman Empire, beautifully displayed in that little site museum by the Agora. But it was also during the Roman period that Corinth became famous for a very different reason. Paul the Apostle, traveling through Asia Minor and ultimately through Greece to spread the gospel, the good news of Jesus, came to Corinth. He found that he had been preceded by others who had started a vibrant Christian church there, mainly among Jews who had been resident in Corinth for a long time, but also with some Gentile or Greek converts as well. He spoke to these communities. Ultimately, he wrote them those beautiful epistles or letters, which include the one about love or charity or agape that figures in so many modern marriage ceremonies. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not agape, the Greek word for disinterested love, I am as but sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. That was written to people in Corinth. Paul decided to go there to get involved with the local people. He was a tent maker himself by trade. That was what he practiced as a job back in his hometown of Tarsus in what is today modern Turkey. And he met some tent makers there in Corinth who took him in and gave him a home. Well, he needed a home because the local Jews, furious with Paul, denounced him to the Roman governor. And to me, the most exciting thing to do in the Agora of Roman Corinth is not to visit the temple of classical Apollo, but to go across the open space of the Agora to the place of judgment of the Romans. And here, during Paul's lifetime, he stood on a floor that you can probably still stand on yourself, outside the little marks for the fence or barricade that separated accused people from their judges. On the other side was a very supreme judge, one of the governing officials of that province of Roman Greece, a man named Gallio, brother of the philosopher Seneca, in judgment on Paul when the local Jews accused him of sacrilege. And Gallio basically said to the Jews, this is a religious matter. You must settle this yourselves. And they settled it with a riot out in that space of the Agora, people coming to blows, blood running in this fury between pro-Christian Jews and the staunch defenders of the old order. Now, as we continue from Corinth, we're going to explore some other sites. We're going to go south along the coast, south and east, to a great religious center of the old order, Epidauros, or as the Greeks will say it, Epidavros. You will pass along the way, as your ride is skirting the western edge of the Saronic Gulf, the old Corinthian port of Kenkriai, today a semi-sunken city, where you can see some of the early Christian buildings out there in the surf, and continue on into the foothills down toward the east and south to this healing sanctuary of the hero god Aesculapius. The Greeks had a tradition that they would believe that certain especially powerful or great mortals might be given a semi-divine status and become called heroes and be worshipped at certain places as if they were gods. If you went to Troy, as many pilgrims did, you could make an offering at the shrine of the divine hero Achilles. Aesculapius was one of those divine heroes, born a mortal, but through his achievements, deified and worshipped, not just at Epidauros, his principal shrine, but all over the Greek world. What was his special area of heroism? Medicine. He was a healer, and he was believed to derive his healing gifts from the god who was the specialist in medicine, the god Apollo. Epidauros has drawn pilgrims for about 2,500 years. When you visit it today, you will see an extraordinary array of buildings which in antiquity were intended to welcome visitors from all over the ancient world who came there to be healed. Epidavros was also a little Greek city-state by the sea, and the propylaea, the gateway into the modern site of Epidavros, links up with a sacred way, parts of which roadbed have been excavated by archaeologists, which leads northward to that little town on the sea, Paleo Epidavros, Old Epidavros. People from Old Epidavros controlled the shrine, just as people from Athens controlled the activities on the Acropolis. People from Corinth controlled the worship of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth. But it drew from all over because illness is a universal human condition. Everyone at some time in their life needs healing. This was, of all others, the most important place to bring your problems. If you had come in ancient times, you would have passed, as you can as a tourist today, through that propylaea, that great gate. You would have entered a vast sanctuary, perhaps one of the biggest ones in Greece. In fact, it included within it an entire stadium and area for athletic games. It had one of the largest theaters in the Greek world, a spot that will be the climax of our visit. And it also had places sacred to the healing god, Aesculapius, where you would spend the night. You would sleep, hoping that a dream would visit you, hoping perhaps that one of the sacred snakes of Aesculapius would slither up out of its underground lair and bless you by licking your eyebrows or in some other way granting you physically that healing power. You may have wondered at times why the emblem of a doctor and of medicine in today's world is a herald staff with little wings on it with a couple of serpents coiled around it. It comes from this cult of Aesculapius where serpents served that heroic god as the means, the physical, visible means of transferring healing power from the god to the afflicted person. These serpents apparently lived in a circular building called the tholos. Tholos, T-H-O-L-O-S. That simply means a circular building in Greek, and they serve many different functions. The tholos in the Agora at Athens is, for instance, a dining hall and meeting area for counselors, for representatives of the democratic government who will spend night and day in that place so that whatever disaster may happen at whatever hour, there's someone there on duty to respond. The tholos in Delphi, which has been excavated, we still don't know what its function was. But we do suspect that the tholos there at Epidavros, that circular building, is a place where the sacred snakes live down inside the crypt area, and you can still see rings of stone masonry between which the snakes probably lived and received food from above, given to them by the priests of Aesculapius. Pilgrims with their ailments didn't sleep in the tholos itself. It appears that a large rectangular building whose foundations are still visible adjoining the tholos area, they went there to sleep and hoped that the snakes would somehow come, either spiritually or physically, to visit them and grant them dreams that would indicate how to cure them, or simply, magically, through their touch, cure their ills. Now, we all know it can take a long time to get cured. And it was certainly the hope of the people of Old Epidavros, who ran this sanctuary, and certainly intended to run it for a profit, that pilgrims would stay a long time. It's clear from the stadium that there were games to entertain them, to draw them, to make them put up at local houses and buy lots of local food. But the main draw at Epidavros must have been that extraordinary theater. And many people never get to the rest of the site. They enter through the main gates, they walk up the beautiful shady path to the theater, passing the archaeological museum on their left, and they enter what is a place of magic still today. The best preserved theater from the ancient world, a theater whose lower 34 tiers of seats were created by the classical Greeks, but then were augmented by an additional 21 tiers of seats put in by the Romans to make that theater at Epidavros surpass all others. It's the site today of a great festival every summer, of ancient dramas, both comedies and tragedies, worth going to, I assure you, even if you don't understand a word of Greek. For the excitement of sitting in those seats where so many thousands have sat before you, from hearing the air echo with those ancient lines of verse, of comedy, of tragedy, from watching the actors down on the stage, sometimes in very contemporary style productions, and from hearing that sublime, that marvelous acoustic. Somehow the Greeks captured, with a true genius, the ability of stone arranged in a semicircle to reflect back into the center the sound, and to derive from the center, from actors standing down at the focal point of the theater, words which, even when spoken in a whisper, had the ability to reach the highest tiers of seats. This is the magic of Epidavros, and one that, fortunately, you can still very much appreciate yourself. Epidavros also gives you the chance to see a theater in true working trim. You are seeing the complete circular orchestra that would have had a little altar of Dionysus, the god of the theater, standing in the middle. Around that orchestra is a great trough cut in the stone, laid down in the masonry. A theater this big, which is open to the sky, is in wintertime going to shed a lot of water. This trough was a very practical method for dealing with all of the runoff and carrying it away. The Greek engineers at work. But the engineers were at work in another area too. Opposite the spectators, on the far side of the circle of the orchestra, where the chorus would sing and dance and the actors would come down and play their parts, is the rectangular skene building, that S-K-E-N-E word from which we get scene, and behind it there was a gigantic mechanism called the crane. In fact, our word machine, mechanic, comes from the Greek word for crane, mechane, because this crane was one of the most impressive pieces of machinery and engineering in the Greek world. And it was applied, as so much of our technology is, not to warfare or to commerce, but to the entertainment industry. These cranes would lift up actors, swing them up and over the roof of the skene building, the scene building, and hang them out over the stage. To the left and the right were the chorus with their separate entrances, each one called a parados. In front of them spread the tiers of seats that they could look out to, and then, speaking as gods, they would declaim the end of the play. They would wrap up the action. They would deal out fates and fortunes to the various principal characters of the drama. In Latin, the word for one of these figures flown in on the great crane was deus ex machina, God from the machine. And so we still use that phrase today for any work of art, be it a movie or a stage play or a novel, that drags in by the hair of its head without any proper reason for being, rationale, someone who will, with the twinkling of an eye and the wave of a wand, fix whatever the dramatic problem is so that the work of art can end. That's our deus ex machina, but for the Greeks it was a moment of epiphany, a word which means shining forth, as the god appeared floating, flying above the stage in what must have been some of the most dramatic moments anyone has ever seen in a theater. You can play a role at Epidavros. There's an international folk festival on that site every day that it's open to tourists. Go out to the sweet spot in the center of the circle, today marked by a stone. Take your turn and then stand there, as many others will have stood before you, and do what they have done. Sing a song, recite a poem, express feelings for a distant loved one, but speak your piece. You too will have the thrill of knowing that your friends up in the tiers are hearing that magic acoustic carry your ordinary, normal tone of voice way up to the very top of this great theater. And I hope that you will remember, as you speak into that great space, which has enshrined some of the greatest moments in all of Greek drama, that there are others listening too, the shades and ghosts and spirits of all those previous pilgrims to the healing shrine of Aesculapius at Epidavros.